morning. My name is Liz Bernacci, and I'm the compensation practice leader at Insight. And I'm really going to focus on compensation trends and projections for 2018. I have to say it's not exciting news, but it's not bad news either. So we're going to talk a little bit about merit budgets. And we have an 8-year trend on merit budgets that hasn't really changed that much, so I'm going to walk through that. The emphasis for this year is still going to be on rewarding high performers. I'm going to touch on key legislation. I'm sure you can all guess what 2 pieces of legislation I'm going to talk about. And then the 5 key focus areas for employers. So the things that I think you could be doing this year, or if you're not already doing, that are really going to support what's going on in the marketplace. So this is the outlook for base pay. The story is pretty similar to what it's been the last 8 years. Overall, we're looking at 3%. If you look at this based on cost of living adjustments versus merit budgets versus other types of increases, there's a bit of a variation. So in 2017, cost of living was estimated to be 2%. And as of right now, it's going to come in at about 1.5%. So some organizations are just not really doing cost of living. They're doing nothing. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of a downward trend on what's actually coming out for cost of living. But in 2018, we're expecting if companies are doing cost of living, it will be about 2% again. Merit increases, so no big story here, still 3%. We're finding that 90 to 95% of organizations are doing merit increases, and it is pretty much across the board. It doesn't feel a lot different actually than a COLA, just a little bit more money, because we don't see a lot of variation in what individuals are receiving. Other types of increases, we're talking about promotions, market adjustments, equity adjustments, which could become big in 2018. About 0.5% of payroll, so very little money going towards those type of increases. And again, everybody's trying to come in at 3%. So if you're doing a 3% merit, you don't really have any money left for these other types of increases. So companies are really trying to balance potentially a lower merit with a little more money for top performers. Massachusetts is going to follow the national averages, so we see about 3%. And again, for 8 straight years, we're not seeing any differentiation based on employee group. So if you have an hourly employee or an exempt employee or an executive, the budget is 3%. Many years ago, you would see exempt employees and executives getting much higher increases than hourly staff, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, actually, because the hourly people don't make a lot of money, but that's how it had been for a very long time. And now we're just seeing kind of flat across the board for everybody. We are seeing slightly higher budgets in some industries. Professional services is one, pharmaceuticals, of course. I know we've talked about this a lot with some of our clients in that area. Energy and consumer products. But when I say slightly higher, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. So we're not seeing a tremendous increase on those budgets. If you have a salary structure in place, those structures are moving about 2% for 2018. It tracks about a percentage point behind merit budgets. And if you want to keep your structure current, you want to move at that 2% every year to stay on track. A lot of companies will work with them, they'll create a salary structure, and then they won't touch it again for 5, 6 years. And what happens is your structure then gets very behind the marketplace, and you're not bringing people in at the right pay rate to stay competitive. And then you have to do a lot of work and pay a lot of money to get that structure back where it needs to be. So 2%, small price to pay to keep your salary structure where it needs to be. Amy talked a lot about high performers. We're always trying to find ways to reward high performers. You can see with merit budgets, there isn't really a lot of money to do that. The majority of employees fall around the middle performance level. That's about 70% of the population of employees, and they're getting about 3%. The low performers, we're seeing a very consistent trend that companies are saying we're no longer going to give anything to those individuals. Either get your performance up or your salary is not going to move. That frees up a little bit of money on the top for that 22% to get a slightly higher merit budget. Keep in mind that 4% is kind of on average. Some companies will give 6 or 7% for that top performer, but they often will cut the middle performers down to 2.5%. So you really have to work very creatively to do much with a 3% budget. So again, the limited budgets that are available are not really allowing companies to retain the top performers. So if you're looking to really help keep those people, those really top high potentials in place, you're not really going to do it with the merit budget. You're going to need some other vehicle, whether it's a high potential program or a variable comp program to really make that happen. The place that we're seeing a lot of movement and the biggest growth is on variable pay. So some organizations are actually doing away with merit programs and they're putting their money on the variable side. They're really trying to get people as much cash in their pocket. Variable programs are a one-time cost, so it's not a fixed cost that increases the bottom line for the company every year, and you can budget for these, and you can still reward the employees and they feel the impact of that. In 2017, you can see we have different average budgets for each of the groupings, and this is a percent of salary, so hourly employees on average are getting 5% of pay as a bonus. Exempt employees 13%, executives 35%. And those numbers are going to come in pretty consistently this year, which is good news. Most companies are trying, if they're budgeting, they're trying to actually pay out their bonus programs. 2018, we're not seeing much of a difference. Budgets will be about the same. These are more for your larger employers, but we often tell smaller companies if you can do anything, even for your high potentials or your critical employees or your senior team, you can get a bang for your buck if you put a plan in place to reward them. The other good piece of news is that we're seeing a continual uptick in the number of companies that are offering variable pay. So right now we see 85% of companies are offering some type of annual incentive plan to their employees, up 1% from last year. So every year we see more and more companies kind of getting on the bandwagon with variable pay. And the goal here really is to maybe target total cash, so your base plus your incentive, to be competitive with the market. So instead of focusing just on base salary, really using that variable pay program to make sure that you're kind of at the market or leading the market with compensation. In terms of anybody coming out of college or graduate school, we're actually not seeing a lot of variation in what the hiring rates are. So you can see here, PhDs coming out for the first time, 100,000. Master's degrees, non-MBA, around 75. MBA, depending on the tier of the school, top tier school, over 100,000. MBA, non-top tier, just below 100,000. And then bachelor's degree really depends on whether it's a technical degree, IT or biotech, coming in at 65. The non-tech, more the liberal arts, in the mid-50s. And this isn't really much different. We're talking 0.5% to 1% higher than what we saw last year coming out of colleges. What we are seeing on this side is that more organizations are offering new hires out of college a sign-on bonus. And those sign-on bonuses vary between $5,000 and $15,000, and it really is tied to degree. So the lower sign-ons are for your bachelor's degree, your higher sign-ons are for your PhD or your MBA students. Some of this could be to offset the issues with large debt that students are coming out of college with, and I know that Darren's going to talk a little bit about different programs in that area, I think. But some organizations are kind of throwing sign-on money as a way to get those new college grads in the door. Overall, we expect hiring to go up about 5% in the industry, across all industries, for new college grads. This is one of my favorite things every year, like what are the hot jobs, because we do a lot of market pricing at Insight, and I have to say these have really been, when I saw the list that was published, these are right on the money, because these are the jobs that clients are calling us about. Obviously IT, cybersecurity with all the hacking, because people have a lot of time to hack apparently. They're looking for people who have a lot of skills in that area, so we're constantly pricing those jobs. Data scientist, which is a very analytical and technical job, which really mixes a unique skill set. We see a lot of those in biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and that has been a hot job for us to price for many of our clients. Engineering, it really runs the gamut. Electrical, mechanical, software are the big three that we're spending a lot of time pricing. Digital marketing, which I love because people use that to get more money, but often they're not actually doing digital marketing when you look at the role that they're performing. But those jobs are really focused on taking the strategy and making it happen through some source of media, and the market is paying big money for those roles. And finally, mobile applications. We all have our iPhones, we're constantly using apps. This is a big area. Every company wants to find a way to get their product out in different ways, and a lot of mobile application development is where they do it. So how do you handle these jobs? We often say the most important thing to do is have a compensation strategy in place to retain them. There are two approaches that I've seen in the market. The first one I'm not as big a fan of, which is to pay a premium for those jobs. So if you pay at the market median for your positions, then you want to target market 60th, 65th, or 75th to really kind of uptick on those jobs to make them more attractive to candidates coming in. The problem with doing that is if it's not a job that's going to be critical for a long period of time, you now have people sitting in the organization making a lot of money. You can't really say, hey, I'm going to take that 10 or 15% back now because we don't really need your skill set. So what I would recommend as another option is to go the variable pay route. So do some type of performance-based incentive or some type of retention program so they still have a base salary that's competitive with the market and with the peer group internally, but they're getting an extra benefit through some type of other compensation vehicle. That way later on, if that's not critical anymore, you can move that plan and you're not really taking any day-to-day money away from the employee. This is an interesting slide because MSITE does a policies and practices survey every year, and they really link compensation to sort of the key concerns out in the market. And I say it's interesting because these are the same 6 topics that have come up kind of consistently year over year that are linked to compensation. So employers say the cost of benefits is a huge concern, especially since salaries are not moving. You know, merit increases are not really covering, or cost of living adjustments are not really covering the increased costs that employees are having to pay for their benefits. The falling unemployment rate, the competition in the marketplace, trying to get the right person in, not having a lot of choices, or having too many choices is impacting compensation. Compensation competitiveness. Most of our clients will say they think they know what the market is, but they haven't actually tested it. A lot of it is hearsay through employees coming and going, but we often say do a market study if you can. Get your finger on the pulse of what your competitors are doing and really look at where you stand relative to the local market. Skills shortages. We have a number of clients that put employees in jobs because they need the work done, but the employees don't necessarily have the skills to do the job, and it becomes a balancing act. What do you pay them? Because they're not really performing the job that you need them to do because they don't have the skills. So putting some plans in place, some training programs in place would probably alleviate this issue, give people some bumps in compensation as they acquire skills, and then maybe eliminate that particular concern. Employee morale, engagement, and employee retention, I think, are tied. There are a number of different things that companies can do, not just around compensation, but obviously high potential programs, employee surveys, really trying to get ahead of what the issues are and taking action to make sure they're eliminated. So they're not all driven by compensation, but to some degree they are all linked to compensation. Legislation. The 2 most interesting topics. Have I not spent enough time on FLSA? So here we are with FLSA. As you may recall, at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, there was the big push for the overtime update. As of August of this year, that was permanently squashed. So the push that Obama was trying to get through to really raise that salary threshold is now gone as of this particular time. So we are back to the federal salary level of $455 a week. Keep in mind, if you have employees in California and a couple other locations, that rate is different. But we're still pretty low at the $455, and there's no change to the current duties test. What's interesting right now is that the Department of Labor has submitted an RFI. So they're really looking for your input on what they should do with the next proposal, because there is another proposal coming. We don't know what it will look like. The guess is it will look similar to the one that Obama tried to put through, but that it will come in at a lower rate, and there'll be some other changes to the executive test. So right now, they want to identify a methodology for setting that salary threshold. So obviously, $455, it's almost useless to have because everybody's above it. So what should the level be, and how should we determine it? One of the questions is, should we have different salary levels if you're in the north versus the south, or the east or the west? Where the cost of living is different, should we have a different salary level? I will say internally as an organization, if you have employees all over the country, that's going to be a lot to manage. So if you have feedback about that, you should submit some responses to the RFI. They also want to know if we should automatically update this salary level on a regular basis. We haven't updated it in a really long time. Does it need to be updated every year? Probably not. But what is the right methodology, and how often should it be updated? And what should be the trigger or the basis for determining that an update is needed? And then finally, if employers did implement the new rule, they want feedback. So was it a financial burden for the organization? What stumbling blocks did you have? How did it go with employees? They just want to make sure they're ahead of the curve, because the number one argument that they got from retail, hospitality, healthcare was that it was going to be a huge burden to those organizations. So if you have any thoughts on that and you're in those industries, they're really looking for some input. It would be great to get this right the next time we try and get it out. In terms of your actions, if you didn't do anything before the overtime update was put on hold, then you don't need to do anything yet. Some organizations, and actually Insight worked with a few that went ahead and did implement the changes. So if you did do that and you made some pay action changes and some exemption changes, we say leave them in place. Don't take money away from somebody that you raised to that proposed threshold. If you were doing it on a staggered basis and you have some still pending, I would say hold on those and wait to see what happens in the next quarter or 6 months. The second piece of legislation that's very big for Massachusetts is the Mass Pay Equity Law. And this is really about equal pay for work of equal value or comparable work. And it really says that you can no longer discriminate how you pay people based on their gender. So if you have a number of people in a particular job and they're of one particular gender, you can't pay people of a different gender in the same job or doing comparable work at a rate that's lower unless there are specific instances that can be justified. When we say comparable work, we're talking about work that is substantially similar. So it has to be similar in skill, responsibility, effort. It has to be done under the similar working conditions. So, different shifts of work, different environments, different hazards. Everything has to be comparable for the jobs to be considered comparable. The law does allow for some pay variations, and some of these are very much common sense. Seniority is obviously the most obvious one. If the jobs are comparable, but you have someone with 5 years more experience than someone else, you can certainly pay the person with more experience at a higher rate than the less experienced individual. If you have a bona fide merit system in place, so you are measuring performance on employees and you have high performers and low performers, you can differentiate pay based on the contributions that people are making. If you have a system in place that's really measuring your earnings based on production, I often think of sales jobs as the most common area. So if two people are in the same job, but they have different production levels, one is bringing in a lot more business than someone else, you can differentiate pay based on production as well. Geographical location, you have an employee in Florida versus an employee in New York. Obviously you can pay higher in New York than in Florida because the cost of living is different in those different locations. The next one's a little bit tricky, education, training, or experience. So it depends to the degree that it's relevant for the position. So if someone has a PhD, but you hire them to do an accounting job, they don't really need the PhD to be an accountant. So you can't necessarily say the education justifies a higher pay level. It has to be relevant to the job that they're performing. And then travel, if someone travels regularly and it's necessary for the job and it's going to upset work-life balance, you potentially could pay someone who's on the road a lot more than someone who's in the office, because you're kind of compensating them for that lifestyle. Similar to third shift versus first shift. You could offer somebody a shift differential if they're working 11 to 7, whereas you wouldn't need to do that during the day, and that's justifiable. Mass pay equity legislation is interesting because it goes further than any other state legislation to date. So Massachusetts is leading the way. And we are the first employer to ban an employer's ability to ask a candidate what they're making. Personally, as a comp person, this is my favorite part of this law because often the first question somebody asks is, what are you making? And they say, well, I'm making 40. Now they're paying $60,000 internally and they're thinking, I can save $20,000 if I bring this person in because I know they don't need to make that much. The reality is the person gets in the door, everybody starts talking, and immediately you have an issue because that employee knows you undercut them. So you can no longer do that, and I think it's going to be important to have a good sense of what the market's doing so that you're offering the right offer to that candidate when they come in. If the candidate does volunteer the information, that's okay, but I think candidates will know about this, and they will know not to speak about what they're making. So they're going to want to come in and get a competitive rate, and they're going to want to know that you know what the market is paying. You're going to want to update your employment applications. You're going to want to change the way you do your interviewing to make sure that you're not asking any questions that are unlawful. So there'll be a lot coming for this. It's going to go into effect July 1st, 2018. And I'm sure there'll be more information forthcoming around the interview process and applications to really help employers make good decisions during this change. The other thing is you can't prohibit employees from talking about what they're making in the workplace, and they can talk about other employees' wages, which seems terrible. It's kind of the water cooler talk, but it does happen. It will continue to happen, and it's now unlawful for you to punish those employees if they do that. On the positive side for employers, there is some defense for wage discrimination if you do your due diligence. So if you do a reasonable self-evaluation, you do a pay equity study, and you take that action within 3 years of making changes to any of your compensation, the courts will give you a period of time, as long as you show good faith, to get those pay variances adjusted. So if you do know that you have any issues internally, you can take care of them, and as long as you're doing a good job in making that effort and you have an action plan, then you should be relatively free of any issues with the law. So pay equity is going to be a big deal. We do some pay equity studies for clients. It is very time consuming. You have to really look at every detail of every employee. It's not just what they're doing at your organization. You need to look at their past history, where they came from, how much experience they have, their salary history. It's not a quick process. So I would recommend starting to look at pay equity no later than January to make sure that you're ready to go when the law goes into effect on July, I think it's July 1st, 2018. Okay, 5 key areas of focus based on everything that I've covered. The number one thing on my list this year is pay equity. So if you haven't started thinking about it, you want to develop an action plan now and get started on how you're going to go through that process to assess if you have any pay discrepancies. And if you do find discrepancies, you immediately need to put an action plan together to make sure that those discrepancies are corrected. The second is to ensure you have the right tools in place for measuring performance. This is going to be important for the limited merit dollars. If you really want to get your money to your top performers, you're going to want to make sure that you're measuring everybody in the same way and evaluating people in the same way so that you do give the money to the right individuals. The third thing is to create and implement a variable pay program. I know it's difficult to do this with the entire organization. What we've done with some of our clients so far is started with a group of employees, so maybe it's senior leadership, or high potentials, or hot jobs, or sometimes it's the entry level. It's the people that kind of keep the doors open, who are doing the everyday production work. Start with a variable program for some area of your business to get a little bit of a bang for your buck. The fourth thing is to conduct an employee survey. This goes back to the 6 employer concerns. These concerns are consistent year to year. So doing an employee survey and really assessing what your employees are concerned about and developing action plans to deal with them is the best way to kind of start removing some of those consistent concerns that pop up every year. And the final thing, which is the most important, which is where we spend a lot of our time, is really helping clients understand their target market. So you want to ensure that you're competitive, you have a program in place that rewards appropriately, and that you know what all your jobs should be getting paid in the market. Insight works often with the survey group. They are a local provider of survey data. It's not just compensation data. They provide benefits data, practices and policy information for HR professionals. If you are looking to do your own compensation work, the survey group has a compensation survey that covers Massachusetts, down to Rhode Island, southern New Hampshire, and it really has a breadth of jobs. There are probably 800 jobs in the survey that cross from HR to IT to healthcare. It's a good source of information for local companies. And this is just an example of a survey page. It is from the benchmark survey of the survey group, but if you haven't seen a survey before, you can get a lot of information very easily by participating. You submit your data to an organization and you get a report back. And you can have the data cut by the size of your business, what your sales volume is, where you work in terms of your geography in the state, the type of business that you're in, it's technical or non-technical, or maybe you're healthcare. And it will give you base salary information, the low in the market, the median in the market, the high in the market. It will tell you what companies are paying for bonus, what total cash looks like, and what targets are. So what did people actually get paid and what were they targeted to get paid? So you can see, well, this company didn't pay that, these companies aren't paying that high, but they're targeting a good program. So you can get a good sense of what your program should look like if you have jobs of similar capacity as these roles. So. And finally, just in summary, overall, expect the status quo, and I mean that from a compensation trend perspective. Obviously, legislation is going to be very busy this year. Merit budgets will remain flat, again, 8-year trend. So it's kind of like ho-hum news, but it's also good news because we could be going backwards and not giving any increases. So a 3% flat budget is actually a good thing. The emphasis this year will be to continue to reward high performers. That will be done through slightly higher merit increases. It will also be done through the leveraging of variable pay programs for organizations who have them. We will continue to watch legislation. I don't expect we'll see much on FLSA in the next 6 months, but we will be seeing a lot on the pay equity law. Insight will be sending out client alerts as information comes out about any changes or updates or further information to help you with the implementation of that particular law. And again, focus on these 5 key areas: pay equity, measuring performance, putting a variable pay program in place, conducting an employee survey, and assessing your target market. Any questions? I went really fast. Yes.
I have one. For small segments of employees, what have you seen variable pay programs based on?
I mean, in terms
So
of
if you pulled
measures,
out high performers, or if you pulled out a small section of employees, how are they measuring or assessing the variable pay? What do they get? You know.
so it depends on the grouping. If we're looking at kind of say a senior leadership team, it's driven off the financials and goals. So there's usually MBOs in there somewhere. So the financials drive the funding, the goals accomplishment drive the allocation. When you look at more of your hot jobs, it's more around the goals. You know, those jobs typically have a specific focus of things they need to get done in that particular year, and so they're rewarded as they hit the milestones for those particular initiatives. I often say, like, if you don't have a plan in place today, create something simple. Don't create something complicated with 15 measures and, you know, charts, and because employees can't really get a sense of what that means. They have to have line of sight for it to be an incentive. So the easier it is for them to understand, the more effective it will be for them to be motivated to drive to the number. Any other questions?
Just a quick question on the Equal Pay Act in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that the Attorney General's office will be providing regulations on it. Have you seen anything yet?
We haven't seen anything. I would imagine by the end of the 4th quarter, we'll start seeing, excuse me, regular updates from them. And I'm sure more than a few updates will come. This one seems a little more clear-cut to follow versus the messiness of the FLSA. So hopefully we'll get some good direction.